Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking a look at this National Conveyancing Week session about inquiries, which I'm really grateful for everybody to participate in. I'm Chris, I'm a practicing solicitor, and I'm chairing today. I'm also involved in a business that's trying to tackle this problem called collaborative conveyancing. Given time is of the essence for everybody in this, I think today's focus is aimed at explaining what inquiries are, talking about, for estate agents, for consumers, the impact that they have on cases, but also talking a bit about conveyancers and the impact on them and how maybe the process can be looked at and the impact on people when it goes wrong. So without further ado, I think I'll just ask each of the participants to introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll get straight into it. So Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Sams. I'm a partner at Dutton Gregory Solicitors and soon to be taking over the role of Head of Department of Residential Conveyancing at Dutton Gregory. So I've been doing conveyancing for many, many years now.
Marion?
Yes, I'm Marion Palmann. I was co-owner with Chris Pirrie of Pirrie Palmann conveyancing firm for 27 years, retired from there 18 months ago, and I now, in addition to working with Chris at Collaborative, I have a complaint handling role for medium-sized firms, so I see things from that end now.
Paul?
Yeah, morning everyone. I'm Paul, I'm a solicitor, been a solicitor for 30 years in the property sector. I'm also Director of Lending and look after the Legal Eye business and the Amity law firm within the Pexa Group family.
Thank you. And Richard?
Morning, I'm Richard, Technical Director at Rebrick Solutions. I've been with Rebrick now for 14 years. Rebrick are a legal case management provider, so my interest here is from a technical, that's my background. I'm a developer at heart, and that's where my experience lies. So we work with our clients in terms of providing them with software to handle the process. So that's really my perspective on the conversation.
So that's really helpful. I think we've got a really exciting bunch of team members to talk through issues, and hopefully it'll be very informative for you all listening, or watching, I should say. First of all, the word inquiries is bandied around left, right and centre. If you're an estate agent, no doubt you'll have heard it many times where one side is saying that the other isn't responding to inquiries, and as a consumer, this section of the transaction takes a long time. It's not always apparent what that is. So I thought maybe we'll start by just nailing down what are they and what problems do they cause. So, Marion, how would you describe inquiries and where do they sit in the conveyancing process?
Well, they certainly do take a long time. That's true. They arise after the contract has been delivered by the seller's conveyancer to the buyer's conveyancers. That's the point at which the buyer's side gets an opportunity to read through all the technical information, check the title information, and review things like planning consents and works that have been done at the property, etc. So the inquiries will then be a method of teasing out the information about whether the works have been done properly with all the right consents, whether the property has the correct rights, we call them easements, for the use of the property, whether there have been any disputes, and if so, what they were about and whether they've been resolved. It covers such a wide range of things. I think this is one of the reasons that the consumers get so fed up with it, because it's a very wide scope and it can go on for a very long time, and it's not always clear when an inquiry has been answered, and things can keep coming back for more and more discussion, and it can be very long drawn out. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration for consumers arises. You might think that you've dealt with all your inquiries, but then there can be another one.
So it's a pack of information is given by the seller to the buyer's lawyer, and the buyer's lawyer then asks questions about that information to clarify points, in essence, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and it's a little bit subjective sometimes, because what one conveyancer thinks is important to ask may not be important to another conveyancer. So there's often quite a lot of discrepancy in the weight that people attach to these things, which causes it causes frustration between the lawyers sometimes as well, because you often get a situation where one lawyer will think, well, you don't need to ask that, and then the other lawyer will say, well, it's important to my client. So there's quite a lot of subjectivity as well. It's an area where there is very little that's cut and dried, unfortunately.
So, Sarah, practically, how do you feel about the inquiry element, and how do you think your team feel about sending and receiving them, and can you put some sort of examples into the conversation of where it's sensible and maybe where sometimes it isn't so sensible?
Yeah, I mean, with inquiries, I think, as Marion says, it can be a completely wide range of inquiries. So you can go down to a firm of solicitors or conveyancers who will raise 2 or 3 inquiries on the title, and that'll be it, up to some files where you get maybe 30, 40 inquiries on transactions. So going from nice and straightforward ones about the title, not asking questions about the state of the property, which obviously is outside of our area, opinions and things like that, which you shouldn't be asking, things that are outside of maybe the conveyancing protocol. Going to the other extreme of, I had a set of inquiries the other day on a leasehold house. So it was a leasehold property, but it was a house, and I had a whole raft of inquiries on the Building Safety Act and how many stories the building had, whether it had cladding. So you're going from people that are looking at the documents and raising specific inquiries to those that are raising many unnecessary inquiries, maybe because they might be working from a list or they're not as experienced as some other conveyancers. So it's frustrating from a conveyancer's point of view, especially when you get lots of inquiries that you shouldn't be dealing with or don't need to be raised. And that's where the time comes, going backwards and forwards on lots of inquiries that maybe shouldn't necessarily be raised.
And of the complaints on a transaction that you see, Sarah, is this a large area where consumers and estate agents or home movers or estate agents are really raising frustration complaints, or is it something that is it not one of the big areas?
Yeah, I would say it's relatively large in the sense that people would usually like to complain about delays or perceived delays. So what they think is taking a long time is maybe something that's conveyancers going backwards and forwards with the inquiries, and obviously it's keeping your clients updated as to what's going on. And it is frustrating, like Marion said, if one conveyancer thinks it's an important inquiry and the other one doesn't. It's trying to get past that barrier of going backwards and forwards, and people do not necessarily make formal complaints as such, but it is definitely an area where people would like to raise a concern if it's taking too long in their opinion. So
you've got valid questions and invalid questions, and you're trying to bat them to and from each side and understand what's going on. And I suppose, is there an element of managing risk here in terms of who accepts the risk for the thing that's being asked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, it depends on, you often hear the phrase of whether you'll take a view on something, and it depends on the appetite for risk of the person who's doing the conveyancing as to whether they will, what's called, take a view, as in, actually, that may be a technical legal point, but is the practical outcome of that likely to happen if you advise your client, if you cover it off, to those that are very risk adverse, that won't accept anything until it's 100% covered off in their perspective and in their mind.
So, Paul, you've obviously worked with lenders, you've worked with lawyers, you now you run a compliance business. Why are conveyancers raising so many questions from the lenders, or from what's the relationship of the lender to inquiries from your perspective?
I think just before you get to that point, I think you've also got to remember that the consumer is a lot more aware than they were historically, so they have a lot more information available to them outside of our process. So they hear and they share different pieces of information, which they bring back to their representative. And I asked a group of my friends, what was the best inquiry you've ever had? And so the nameless person that put it forward as actually the best one was, is there a moat around the property? Now, somewhere somebody got that inquiry. Now, there aren't that many moats in the UK, but it just illustrates that, exactly Sarah's point, there's got to be thought at the back of why an inquiry is asked, but also you're representing your client. And if your client comes to you and says, I want that question asked, then there is a balance there as to, from a risk profiling perspective within your organisation, you've got to protect the lender, they're a client, you've got to protect the customer client as well, and you sometimes do have to put certain things forward that somebody is worried about. Now that could be the lender with a special condition or something else. So I think that we have so many balancing factors to take into account when we're raising inquiries. A lot of it is about how we train people and how we educate people to understand the property, understand why we're doing a deal, and the particular circumstances of the individual client.
So, on the files that you're auditing and going to have a look at, what are you seeing in terms of sort of average sort of times that it takes to get through this process, or is there just no average and it can be quick, but quite often it's long? What's the sort of length of time that it's taking to get through inquiries now, and what's holding that up?
I guess a very broad general response to that is that it takes a long time. Now, define long. All Sarah's points absolutely valid. You're getting a lot of queries, you're getting queries that aren't relevant, and it is then very subjective as to how the individual on the other side responds to your pushback of, actually, this is a leasehold house, and therefore as a consequence it is not relevant to ask me about the Building Safety Act. You could find yourself in a month's worth of correspondence following that if that individual actually wants to continue to push the point. And I think actually that educational piece, that training piece, is something that potentially during COVID, potentially during the heightened areas of risk that we see from an audit perspective, every firm has increased their protectionist position on policies and procedures because they're worried and because they're fearful that they will have challenges against their claim, their claim position, their insurance position. So therefore we have perhaps gone beyond where we had professional discretion historically, and we utilize that professionalism and knowledge and understanding to take a view to a position now where we have kind of fixed things in stone for maybe new entrants to the industry, where we're worried about them going outside of their area of knowledge and expertise.
And I suppose, Sarah, just before we get on to Richard, there's a perception by conveyancers that the scope of inquiries has expanded massively since when I was in practice back in the days of black and white telly. Are you perceiving that the responsibility on conveyancers over time has widened and therefore that's driven more inquiries? Is that a fair assessment of what you're seeing out there, and what examples of expansion have occurred?
Yes, I mean, there's definitely more things that are coming within our remit than used to be there. So, for example, a relatively recent introduction is to commenting on things like climate change. And the effect of climate change on properties and things like that. That's now coming. We've got Law Society guidance about what we should be notifying on that, and extra searches and things like that. But also there's the other side of things, that there are supposed to be things in place to sort of limit the scope. So like I mentioned before, things like not asking questions on the state of the property or the condition of the property, which survey should be in place for, things like that. But you find you're battling against those type of queries quite a lot, which are maybe outside of the remit, but people like to put them in anyway. But definitely the scope of what we're being asked to deal with is expanding probably every year, with there's something extra that we might have to cover off in what we're doing.
So I suppose, Richard, thank you, Sarah. Richard, you're you're not a practitioner, you're a technologist provider, you've got one of the leading case management systems in the country. Yeah, as an estate agent or a consumer, you'd sort of assume that everybody's got really great tech and this is really nailed down and everybody knows what's going on. In your experience, for not maybe clients that are using Rebrick, but the rest of the sector, are you seeing that there's a high degree of technology that's solving these problems, or how would you categorise the way in which law firms generally solve this issue?
I think the answer to your question is probably not no, and I think the reason for that answer is tied up into what Marion, Sarah, and Paul have said, and that is if you look at this, if I look at this as a non-conveyancer from the outside in, just the number of moving parts, the variability and the subjectivity in the conversation means that there's no real standardization. Technology works best where you can where you can say input A equals output B, where you've got so many variables in here, different consumer requirements, different different properties, and so much subjectivity into it. I think that makes it quite challenging for technology. I don't think in the same way it's challenging for the conveyancers, incidentally, and I think consequently my answer to your question is no. I do think that conveyancers are using systems, ours and other providers in the space, to record and to communicate with other sides and their consumers on inquiries, but I don't think they're doing that in a standardized way. And also what I don't think they're doing is, and it ties into exactly that point, is probably getting any benefit in terms of automation around that. Now, if you've got some repeat inquiries that come in, perhaps you can define some rules to that. But if what you're saying to us is actually no one case looks the same, that makes it quite hard from a technology point of view, and also from your point of view in terms of applying it. They all look unique. So I think that's the biggest challenge. The answer to your original question is no, and I think the reason it's no is because there's so many moving parts and so much subjectivity into it. Actually creating a system that is all encompassing is actually really, really difficult. I do think maybe the answer is you don't need a system that's all encompassing. You can take software works in an agile way. It's iterative. I think businesses could look to take an agile approach to this. So what we say is, well, let's focus in on a couple of well-defined inquiries that are repeating, and let's deal with those, and then let's build on that and build on that. I also think that technology has a part to play in this conversation in terms of, if I was to ask you, you people being conveyancers, what's the average timescale, what's the most frequent? I'd ask the question, do you actually know empirically, or is it a symptom of your experience? Is it I believe but it's anecdotal, it's not an evidence-based conversation, and I think technology has a part to play in that as well. If we get conveyancers using systems effectively, it can start to give them those answers. It can also surface Paul's point about risk. You can highlight the high risk and the low risk elements. Again, it requires some elements of rule, but I do think all of this is, and the reason why I don't think my original answer is no. I think all of this has to happen in as least frictional way as possible for the conveyancer, because otherwise, if we build anybody can build a system, but if it just involves more work for the conveyancer, it's not going to get adoption. And that's one of the other technology challenges, I think, in terms of what's a blocker to the current. Do I think it's solvable? I absolutely do. I think you start small and you build it out. Start on the common threads and build it out. I don't personally think that when it comes to technology, it has to be all things to all people on day one. Some people will take a different view, but I think if you add some value, then you free up some time for the conveyancer to spend on the more bespoke, the more abstract, that doesn't have moats question in the conversation. So yeah, that's my answer.
I think that's really useful. Thank you. From what I've seen talking to conveyancers, there is a sense that this is a lot more aggressive than it ever used to be. When I was in practice, if there was something missing, I could phone up the other side and they would help me out, and we'd work together to get the transaction through, and that was really good. And most of the conveyancers on the other side were in the same town. Sorry, Richard, did you put your hand up?
I did. Just on your aggressive point, I do think technology can help in that regard, because the one thing technology can help you guys with is visibility. All of the providers, ourselves included, they've all got portals and mechanisms to disseminate information, subject to agreeing how you do it. I think visibility helps to create a bit more clarity in the conversation, because as Marion or Sarah, sorry, I forget which, said earlier, quite often there's a lot of toing and froing, and whose desk it's actually on is not always clear, and why it's slow is not always clear. Sometimes the transaction's slow, and it's no fault of either conveyancer. It's because there's an outstanding question on the client's desk, on the consumer's desk. So I think visibility is an important part of the conversation. Sorry, Chris.
Is it more aggressive, or is that anecdotal? When people are looking at files, do you find that it's more stressful now dealing with this process than maybe it was when any of us started our careers, or is that just a falsehood?
I think that it can be slightly more aggressive than it used to be. I have to be very careful when I'm dealing with replies to inquiries which I think are unnecessary and shouldn't have been raised. I quite often type a reply and then have to speak to a colleague and just say, could you just check this is okay before I send it? Just because the last thing you want to do is set up a competitive relationship with someone on the other side, because my thoughts are that you may have to work with that person again. You all want to get to the same end game, which is to get the transaction completed. There is no point in being aggressive with each other, because no one gets anywhere. So absolutely. I do feel myself typing these replies and then going, no, stop, think, and start again. But I think there are some of the tone of the correspondence that you do receive is quite aggressive. It's quite, right, you're going to give us this stuff now, or we're going to report you to this person, we're going to do this. So it can be certain times, yeah, definitely.
What impact does that have, Paul, when you see it within firms and fee earners and within Amity?
I kind of reflect on that, and I go back a long time, obviously, but I remember incredibly aggressive people on the other side, on the end of a phone, yelling at me to reply to inquiries 20 years ago. So I get what Sarah says, and I think that's absolutely right, but I have a suspicion that is a consequence of the volume of inquiries rather than a change in attitude, because actually I'm not convinced that the attitudes and the positionings have changed. There are some incredibly aggressive individuals in any industry now, and there were some incredibly aggressive individuals historically. We maybe dealt with less cases, and therefore we came across less people years ago. But I think, again, this comes back down to the educational piece. It's how do we as people deal with aggressive individuals in any situation? And it isn't any different. And it is exactly what Sarah said. Let's reflect on how we're replying, because if we have got a volatile nature happening in a transaction, then we need to stop it, because nobody's going to win as a consequence. Some of those battles you just can't win, and you do just let it have to play itself out and find an alternative route to solving it. And I actually don't think that's particularly changed.
I'd agree. I think some of the worst transactions from that point of view used to be on new build estates. When I was at Marion Palmann, and you would raise inquiries because you would know that you were not going to get a registration through on the basis of the paperwork that was supplied, and you would know that all the other plot purchasers must be asking the same questions, surely. But they'd say, well, no one else has asked for that and you can't have it. And you know, sometimes the thing is, these days people don't pick up the phone anymore. They don't pick up the phone and have a conversation and hear each other's voices and get the tone. They send an email, and it's difficult, conveying a tone sometimes when you're having an argument, isn't it? It can sound worse. But I used to intervene sometimes when people had these problems and pick up the phone and ring the other side, and they would be so affronted that I'd interrupted their day with a phone call. it's not done anymore. It's a pity it's not done, but that's where we're at now. Everything is done by email, and it's a bit easier to be rude to somebody in an email than it is to be rude to them on the phone, I think.
I think that's fair. The anonymous nature of emails is making things tougher, I think, and I think that's impacting on the stress within the workforce or within the profession, I should say. In terms of what can estate agents and home movers actually do, if anything, to make this process better, do we think? Is there any tips for those people? Because I know estate agents that I know are tearing their hair out that transactions are taking longer and they can't get to the point where we've exchanged and they can raise their invoices. And I know consumers that just think conveyancing is the devil's work and moving house is the worst thing ever. Is there anything that can be done from their side that would aid this challenging process?
I think all the work that we're doing around upfront information has got to be significant in that. I think the more information that can be available to individuals, to lawyers at the outset, I think there is a big fear about, the person won't buy the property if I tell them all of the information up front, is something that we need to get past, because that is going to be a fall through at a later date, and we're all trying to avoid fall throughs. So I think getting that upfront information, getting us to a situation where when somebody is actually agreeing to purchase a property, they've got most of the info, they know most of the stuff. We can try and encourage people to stick closer to the protocols, and we can make sure that actually we narrow down those supplemental positions. And if it's a multi-storey building, then we can ask the building safety. If it's not, then we know it's not, and that is more obvious and more heightened.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. I mean, I agree with Paul. I think upfront information is there's quite a lot of momentum behind that as a in the industry at the minute, and I think it's inevitable that it's that should move forward. The idea that not sharing that information at the beginning of the transaction is beneficial is counterintuitive. That transaction will fall through at a later point. So if there is a problem, it's better to know about it and get the buyer that wants the property with that problem, and not have it fall through later. So definitely 100% agree with you on that.
Or at least get the seller to put it right before, so that the seller is aware that there is an issue, and if it's rectified, then there is more likelihood of it selling. And that's where a massive area where estate agents can help in relation to that, because they can bring the lawyer in at an earlier point, and we can do checks on the title, and we can make sure from a seller's point of view that it's a stable, strong transaction when we find a buyer for it.
So effectively you're saying that some of the delay and frustrations caused by material present information arising too late in the process now and causing delays for solving things that could have been solved at an earlier stage.
There is potential for that, certainly, and I think where the technology helps hugely is where it helps us organise these things. And I think the technology that's produced in consultation with law firms and with people that are on the ground doing it is usually more effective, and something that helps us to organise the inquiries and put them into locations and allows us to respond to them, or we can use generative AI to deal with some of them. I think that's where we can certainly make everybody's life a little bit easier.
So it helps it enables you also to share some of that with the client in a way that is very difficult at the moment, because if you don't take the client with you on this inquiry journey, they don't understand what you're doing. It's a big chunk of the time, and they don't see what you're doing. They don't see that work, and they don't understand it.
Have you got any tips, Sarah, for professionals in the sector? Probably conveyancers, I suppose. We've talked about estate agents providing more material information and consumers coming on the journey and being explained. What would help you from a conveyancing perspective?
I think it's information gathering as well. So, for example, if you're dealing with the sale of a property and you can see from the title that it was only built a couple of years ago, but the client's giving you no planning documents, no new homes warranties, even though they're asked to do that in all of the protocol forms, it's maybe picking up on it at that stage at the point of issuing a contract and saying to the client, you're going to be asked for this, can you get it to me now? So you're upfront and being proactive as to what you're likely to be asked for. And then going through the transaction, I think it's a lot of managing expectations from clients and agents' point of view as to how long this might take, but also trying to ensure that people don't, obviously not saying people shouldn't chase you for anything, but if the client is updated and there are portals and things like that that can keep them updated and you keep the client updated, is trying to get the balance between putting too much pressure on the person who's dealing with the file so that you don't want to turn around and say, hang on a minute, if you just leave me alone for a second, I can get on and deal with it. So it's managing expectations from all parties so everyone knows what you're doing. And as Marion says, it can take a long time going backwards and forwards. And I myself know that there have been occasions where I'm going ahead and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but you forget to tell the client, so they think you're doing nothing. So it's getting that communication side of things working properly, and technology is great for that side of things as well. So I think that there are certain things that we can do to better communication using technology to do that, and also making sure, again, it's all about upfront information from that side of things, trying to predict what might be asked and doing it at the beginning rather than waiting until just before exchange to start running around.
So is this process, Richard, go on.
Yeah, just building on what Sarah said, I completely agree with you. I think this is not technical, but Rebrick are involved with the upfront information various working groups and whatnot. So a little bit of background here. I think one of my observations here is that this really isn't a technology problem. This is a process and a people problem. And I think the biggest challenge that we have collectively here is not doing upfront information or providing upfront information. It's about convincing the people that need to be involved in that process, because we've got so many different stakeholders, different parties, different vendors involved with different priorities, agendas and processes, and without regulation, it's that the exercise of getting everybody on the same page to understand that actually this is all in your all of your long-term benefit to collaborate on this. And actually, as an agent, it might be extra work to get that information from your consumer at point of listing, but actually your transaction is more guaranteed to complete as a result of doing that. So it's about getting everybody on the same page. I think that's the biggest challenge that we have, not a technology one. It's about building that demand. If the demand is there, the software will appear. There are providers out there that will build the solutions. What you've got to do is get people willing to follow that process. And I think the biggest challenge is the absence of mandation, and the fact that we're across multiple different sectors with different sort of rules and regulations, and just getting everybody on the same page.
So I suspect Richard can't contribute to this, and I think Paul's already given his. Sarah and Marion, have you got any favourite weird and wonderful questions that you've ever, or inquiries you've ever seen? Whilst you think about that, we came across one about a hamster where the client was saying, we buried the hamster in the back garden and it's winter, can we come back when the ground is not solid to come and collect the hamster's remains? And you just can't build a process around a dead hamster in a cardboard box buried in the garden. What have you can either of you two beat that?
Well, one of my colleagues did have a question once, which was literally just, is there anything else the seller thinks the buyer should know? That was quite a poser.
Yeah, I quite often get those little catch-all inquiries at the end, which is very similar to those sort of things. But there was a whole raft of inquiries that came up as a result of something that was in the news, where it was just a general inquiry: has any notorious events happened in the vicinity of the property? So I think one of my colleagues replies, and Chris, you can probably guess whose reply it was, because this was in Southampton, was, well, the Titanic set sail from Southampton in 1912. And there was Another one, I do a lot of shared ownership properties, so this is a story that's been told to me by another trainer, which the question was, has any staircasing taken place? And the response was, this is a flat, there is no staircase. So you do get all sorts of weird and wonderful inquiries. So yeah, there's a couple.
Oh, we did have one once where the buyer said the property is being sold for a price below its value. The buyer is not prepared to proceed on this basis. To which the answer was, well, tell us how much more you'd like to pay.
So it's a complicated process where the burden on conveyancers seems to have got bigger. I think we're in consensus about. And I suppose the question is having got worse, are we hopeful that the things that the industry is doing around material information, around communicating better with estate agents, around technology, are we hopeful that this problem is going to get better and moving house is going to get easier, or are we skeptical that actually, unfortunately, everything is going to get, we are where we are, and conveyancing is going to be a frustrating and long process forevermore? Quick one to close.
I think we can all be hopeful, but I think the difficulty we all have in every area of change in conveyancing, and it's the same thing I usually say, is it's got to have buy-in from everybody involved. So there are certain firms out there who are very up for, upfront information, for trying to make it as easy as possible, and there may be other people that aren't so keen to do that. So unless everybody works together to get systems in place and to work together, it's going to be a long slog, I think, but we can definitely all hope that it will work.
I think the other thing is, does everybody want visibility? That's the other question. And I think, I think sometimes, it's to people's interest for it to be a bit more ambiguous in the conversation. I'm not advocating that. It's just an observation. I think that's a reality of the world you guys operate in.
Yeah. So
I think there's
you're
certainly
less
more.
hopeful. Sorry, go on, Paul.
No, I think there's certainly more positivity around this subject now. I think we had it for 20 years where everybody said it's going to change, it'll get quicker, whatever. But actually, if you things like the CA conference and different events, actually the noise is more collaborative, and the more joined up we are getting, actually I think there's a huge amount to be positive about at the moment, because the engagement level, I think, is greater than it has been.
Yeah, I'd agree with that on a technology point. I've been at Rebrick for 14 years, and certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, the number of collaborative working groups, and there's a little bit of duplication across that, but the level of cross-party collaboration has gone up exponentially, in recent times, I would say.
Marion.
Which is good news for everybody.
It is good news. Are you hopeful, Marion?
I am hopeful, yes. I think so. I think it perhaps had to get worse before it's now getting better. I think it got worse during lockdown. People were terribly aggressive. We saw some really, really awful situations with clients getting very angry and all the rest of it. And I think conveyancers have reached a bit of a low ebb recently and really want things to change. And I think that's part of the reason why everybody's now on board with, let's find a way to sweep this up and organise it better.
So I think to wrap up, this piece has been done for the National Conveyancing Week, which is there to explain what conveyancers do, promote conveyancing, and help estate agents, home movers and conveyancers raise the profile of the challenges that we all face in trying to get somebody to move home. I'm really grateful for the panel's time, so thank you very much, and I hope anybody watching this has found it useful. I think all of us would be very happy for any of you to contact us, and we're discoverable on LinkedIn and elsewhere, but we're very grateful for you taking the time to watch this and understand. So thank you so much to everybody.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.